Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Harbour Midweek Mini. I hope you're well. Thanks for joining me today. This week I'm going to be continuing with my look at the Beatitudes of Jesus. And last week was really a bit of an introduction in which I introduced these 9 famous statements or declarations of Jesus that I did call the foundations or the source of true happiness. And what we're going to do is we're going to try this week to examine the very first Beatitude, a very famous Beatitude, found in verse 3, Matthew 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, I don't want to give away too much yet, but what I want to try and show you in these sessions is that there is a sort of order, a progression, or a development, if you like, to the Beatitudes, that they don't just stand alone as sort of one-off statements, random things that bring you blessing. They're actually all connected, and in some ways you can't really study them individually. They have to be understood as a whole. But the best way of explaining what I mean, perhaps, is seeing them a bit like a ladder, that they're a ladder of blessing, and that each statement is like a rung up the ladder. So this is the very first rung on the ladder of blessing. And Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And that in some ways feels a bit like a sort of strange starting point in talking about this ladder of blessing. In fact, it has a strange starting point and it has a strange ending point, as we'll see. But as it turns out, far from being strange, in the end, we'll see that really this is the only possible starting point in Jesus's teaching. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Try and see it as a ladder of blessing, and this is the first rung. The second thing I wanted to sort of kick off by saying, and I'm sure you've noticed this, is that all of the Beatitudes follow a sort of pattern, a structure, or a formula. And the formula is quite simple. There's first of all a declaration of blessing, blessed are. Then there's a condition, a human condition, if you like, or a human experience typified by a group of people. In this case, it's those who are poor in spirit. And the third part of the formula is the consequence that arises out of that condition. We don't know at face value what this relationship between the condition and the consequence is, and in some ways that's what we've got to work out. But the third part of the formula is this consequence that is the source of blessing. So there's declaration, then there's a condition, and then there's a consequence. And in a way, what Jesus is making clear is you can't have that condition, so you can't have that consequence, i.e. the blessing, without the condition. The blessing, if you like, is the thing that's mediated through the human condition or the human experience. And we have to try and understand how that takes place. How is being poor in spirit, how can that result in blessing? That's the sort of challenge, understanding the human bit, if you like. And I've heard this verse explained away often as just being about humility, and people draw this parallel between being poor in spirit and being humble. But I don't think it means that. I don't think it's, although that's, humility is obviously an important aspect of receiving the kingdom, I don't think that's what Jesus is really getting at here. And what he says, I think, is a lot more stark and a lot more shocking. And I think, as far as possible, it's important that we sort of stick with what Jesus actually said and try and get to grips with it, even if it's a bit uncomfortable. So before we look at what the poverty of spirit actually is, let's just talk a little bit about the consequence in this verse, which is the kingdom of God. Jesus said, for theirs is the kingdom of God. So there's this relationship between being poor in spirit and the possession of the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God as a sort of concept in the New Testament is a very important one. It's one of the great themes of the New Testament. And Jesus spoke about it a great deal, the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And I always remember as a young Christian really struggling to get my head around what it really meant as I sort of devoured the New Testament. And I saw this idea of the kingdom of God everywhere. I didn't really get it, if I'm really honest. And I think now, looking back, I think I understand that really the reason I didn't really understand it, I didn't really get it, was because really, I didn't have that same rich background that Jewish people had. Certainly those living at the time of Jesus would have perfectly understood what Jesus was talking about when he spoke about the kingdom of God. But for me, as a sort of Gentile believer, it was sort of a very sort of abstract idea. And it's only as I've wrestled with the Old Testament and wrestled with the prophets and wrestled with some of these ideas about the coming kingdom in the Old Testament that it's really begun to sort of make sense to me, and I've really begun to understand what Jesus actually was getting at when he came and declared the kingdom of God. Because for those living at the time of Jesus, when they would have heard about this coming kingdom, they were expecting, and I'm sure you know this, they were expecting a real kingdom in terms of a physical kingdom, that a king would arrive, a warrior king would arrive, that he would defeat God's enemies, he would save God's people and establish this everlasting kingdom, and that this king was the Messiah, a son of David, and he would sit for all eternity upon the throne of David. And so there was this real messianic expectation of this coming kingdom, and by the time that Jesus arrives, they even had a sense that it was going to be soon. What nobody expected, of course, was that Jesus came and revealed that the kingdom was not going to come as everyone expected. It wasn't going to arrive in that way at all. And that the kingdom was going to arrive in obscurity. And it was going to arrive and slowly spread and eventually fill the earth. And lots of Jesus's teaching around the kingdom of God expresses this idea of a growing kingdom that starts small, like a mustard seed, and grows. And this was really contrary to what everybody expected, and it was hidden away until Christ came. And what Jesus makes clear, and what all of the New Testament writings make clear, is that this kingdom was going to arrive in the most wonderful of places. It wasn't going to arrive on the battlefield. It wasn't going to arrive through the corridors of power. It was going to arrive in the human heart. And it was the believing human heart that would be the place where God's kingdom would come. It would start on the inside. There would be a moment of inner change, and the kingdom would be experienced in the heart and in the lives of those who received it. And God's kingship, if you like, the king arrives in the human life, and God's kingship and his rule and his authority begin to take effect on individuals. And once we understand that, the verse begins to make sense. And Jesus is making this connection between the human spirit, the inner person, and the coming of the kingdom of God. And what's surprising is that he talks about this idea of the need or the blessedness that comes in some way from those who are poor in spirit. And that's what we need to understand. What's this connection? How does the coming of God's kingdom into a human heart, the heart of a man or a woman or a child, how does that tie up with Jesus speaking about those who are poor in spirit, those who are destitute in spirit? It really is, the word used in the Greek is really a strong word. It means destitute or beggarly, poor, without. I mean, it's difficult to define poverty, I know nowadays, but for me it really means that sort of that lack of basic physical resources that we need in life, and that when they're missing, whether it's a home or food or warmth or security, when those things are missing, our lives become very hard to live. And in the same way that physical poverty is about the lack of resources, so I believe spiritual poverty is about the same thing, but it's about a lack of inner resource, whether that's peace, joy, purpose, wisdom or love. The list goes on and on. To be spiritually poor is when those sort of essential inner resources are missing in our life, and when we don't have them, life becomes tough, life becomes difficult to live. So how can that be a good thing? How can spiritually poor be a good thing? What I would say is I don't think being spiritually poor, having these lack of spiritual resources in our life, I don't think in and of itself it's not a good thing, it's a bad thing. And what we have to understand is that Jesus is saying here that if we're going to receive the kingdom that starts on the inside, we have to come to grips with our true human condition. And I think what this verse is really getting us to think about and getting us to do is to engage in an honest appraisal of what is going on on the inside of us, of each of us. And we're having to face up, if you like, to our inner lacks, our problems, our pain, and of course our sinful attitudes. I think this is why it's so important. We can't begin this journey up this ladder of blessing, if you like, until we come to grips with the fact that something is wrong on the inside of us, and that we've got to see our true spiritual condition as one which is poor, and we've got to see that for ourselves, and we've got to bring that obviously to God. And it's only when we see our need, we see our condition, and we face it and we own it, only then can we begin to understand the wonder of what Jesus has done for us and realise how desperately we need him. And I think that's how we step on this first ladder of blessing, the first rung, if you like, of the ladder of blessing. It's to begin to face the truth about our need for Christ and our need for forgiveness and our need for all that he gives, all the abundant blessings that he gives, and realise that we are without them, without Christ. And for those of us who've come to know Christ, you'll have experienced what I'm talking about. You will have had that moment where you saw yourself and you understood that you needed help and you needed forgiveness and you needed Christ. And it's like you had that moment of looking into the darkness of your inner life. And by doing so, you end up finding the opposite. You end up finding the light of Christ. But that said, although you've had that experience and I've had that experience, I still think it's important to remember that we're not there yet. You know, we have not arrived. And there's still these areas of poverty in our lives. There's still these areas where we're sort of limping along in. We still have our problems. We still have our difficulties and things that we're wrestling with and struggling with. And I think although that's hard, it's good to remember that even for us that have walked with Christ, it's still really good to have those moments of just being honest with God and bringing our hearts to him, bringing our lacks to him, bringing those areas of our life that are out of kilter. And as we do so, as we confess our inner poverty, what we find is that Christ meets us in that, and we invite him into that situation. And it's into those areas that he just loves to bring his kingdom and loves to bring his peace and loves to bring us freedom and allow us to step into life, fuller life, as we do so. So it's a process that begins when we meet Christ, but it's also a process that continues as we continue to walk with him, as we continue to walk out this experience of being a human being, and all the inner stuff that goes on inside of us. So I just encourage you maybe to find some time this week to just have a time of like honest reflection with God, an honest evaluation of where you're at, what's going on in your life and what's happening in your heart, and bring those things to God and confess those things to God. And maybe you've never had that experience of seeing your need for Christ. Well, if that's the case, then I encourage you just to spend time, ask God to show you, to shine his light into your heart and reveal your true spiritual condition. It's a painful prayer, but it's as we've just read, it is the beginning of a pathway to blessing and a pathway to life. So they're my thoughts on the verse. Next week we're going to look at the next one, which is tied in so beautifully with this one, which is about mourning and being comforted. So bless you, thanks for watching, and see you soon.